I don't believe an intro is required for. So we're skipping the formalities and getting straight into the core topic of today's video. As you all know, Season 4 of Invincible has recently come to an end, and alongside the Viltrumite War, with one of its most prominent subplots being the redemption arc of Nolan Grayson. Throughout the earlier seasons, we were mostly privy to what I can only describe as an existential crisis, despite him being a man who had spent centuries conquering planets in the name of the Viltrumite Empire, suddenly forced to confront the reality of what he had become. Just 20 years on Earth was enough to change him. Not only did it become a place he could generally call home, but he learned to love it in a way that was never natural to him before, or his people. And by the time the 4th season rolls around, especially in its latter half, that shift is no longer uncertain. He isn't hesitating anymore, he isn't conflicted anymore. He is willing to stake his life on the sanctity of Earth. Which brings us to the real question. Not whether Nolan has changed, that's a different topic altogether, but whether someone like him could ever truly be redeemed. Or the question of what it truly means to redeem yourself. What I genuinely appreciated about what the series did when portraying the perspectives of those closest to Nolan is that they never once tried to sugarcoat or outright ignore the sheer scale of the atrocities he's committed. In a lot of stories, for the sake of the bigger overarching plot, they tend to soften the past or simply downplay the severity for the sake of the redemptionee. Nah, Invincible doesn't do that. It forces both the characters and by extension the audience to sit with what Nolan has done. They don't suddenly act as if his actions can be brushed aside simply because he's changed. If anything, their interactions with him feel heavier because of it, as opposed to the comics. Whilst I do think it's commendable that Nolan is trying to take accountability for his actions, I think it's even more important that the show allows that effort to be met with visceral resistance, because that resistance is what makes it feel not only human, as mentioned earlier, but also better earned. This isn't a world that bends to accommodate his redemption. If anything, it pushes back against it. The arguments, the tension, the emotional distance, they aren't obstacles to his arc. They are the arc. They act as a constant test of whether Nolan is simply saying the right things or whether there is actual weight behind the actions he chooses to take now. Art's reaction to Nolan comes from awareness. He understands exactly what Nolan is and what he's done, what he's capable of, and because of that, his interactions feel less emotionally explosive but no less significant. He doesn't excuse Nolan, he doesn't fully condemn him either, because it introduces another dimension to redemption. Not everyone who accepts your presence again is offering you forgiveness. Sometimes they're simply choosing to move forward, while remembering exactly who you were. You can see it for what it is when the moment Art tries to cut their time short with him saying there being repairs and such that needs to be tended to. What could have easily been framed as a moment of reconciliation is instead laced with discomfort. The conversation feels strained, almost cautious, and rather than signaling that things are okay again, the show makes it very clear that Art's willingness to sit there isn't born out of forgiveness. It's a mix of fear and history. And it's reinforced in a much subtler but far more telling way when Nolan asks if Art could make a costume for old time's sake, and that's where the latter draws the line by making it clear.
I dress heroes, Nolan.
It's a small line, but it carries weight, because it draws a boundary, not just between what Nolan was and what he claims to be now, but between how Art sees him and how Nolan might want to be seen. In Art's eyes, that title isn't something Nolan can simply step back into. It's something he has to earn, and if it can even be earned back at all. And I feel it stings so much more, especially with the fact that it provides a bit of an emotional whiplash, considering that I'm quite sure in Nolan's eyes, Art was still someone that he could talk to. Cecil is something much more direct. His interactions are shaped by consequence, by the sheer scale of what Nolan's actions have done to the planet. Because Cecil isn't just reacting to Nolan as a person. Just like Mark, just like any other Viltrumite he has interacted with, he is reacting to the instability of a rogue Viltrumite. In his interaction, he doesn't need to raise his voice to establish dominance in the conversation, because the world's state after the events of Season 1 are already all the ammunition that he needs to justify his stance on Omni-Man. So when Cecil engages with Nolan, it isn't about forgiveness or even understanding. It's about making sure that Nolan truly is not a threat this time round. From the way he says early on,
I will never not be afraid of you,
to even making a point about how the war wasn't won, despite Nolan trying to frame it as a victory. He cuts straight through it, pointing out that what actually happened wasn't a clean victory. It was quite literally the exacerbation of an already dangerous threat and that the Viltrumites are still very much intact and are very much angry. And the moment he brings up that fact, it reframes everything Nolan or the Coalition has done. It sort of strips away any sense of finality or accomplishment, because it's by this point within the animated story at the very least, they don't know where the Viltrumites at. They don't know where Thrag is. They don't know where all the other 40-something Viltrumites are. And even by the end of it, Cecil doesn't want Nolan on the planet anymore, unless it's for the sake of protecting it. In his eyes, Nolan has done far too much damage, far too many casualties, for him to even justify allowing Nolan to even be there anymore. We're now moving to one of the more emotionally strained relationships shown in the series, Nolan's relationship with his youngest son, Oliver. It should be noted that the animated series deviates from the comics in a way that I find to be far more suitable. From what I've researched, Oliver's animosity to his father is not as drawn out or fleshed out in the comics. Unlike Mark, whose pain is rooted in betrayal and years of deception, Oliver's resentment carries a different weight. He never knew the quote-unquote loving father version of Nolan that Mark grew up with, only stories with some of them being good and, after a while, mostly bad. However, there was even a time where he would look past those faults in hopes that it was simply hyperbole. That is, of course, until he hears a particular apology scene, and after that begins to hold animosity and hatred. In their key scenes, Oliver doesn't just push back, he actively dismantles Nolan's attempts at reconnection with cold rejection initially. This new dynamic forces Nolan into an uncomfortable position, of course. He can't rely on the emotional history he still shares with Mark or Debbie. With Oliver, there's almost no goodwill left to draw from. Every attempt at fatherly advice or concern feels like an intrusion or impedance on wounds that are not yet ready to be addressed. What I find especially interesting here is how this interaction challenges the idea of redemption through family alone. With Mark, despite him honestly messing him up really bad, there was still a very convoluted and conflicting but present father-son bond that Nolan could appeal to. And with Debbie, it was something similar in that they were married. But with Oliver, that bond barely exists, and he refuses to pretend otherwise just because his father finally had his morality awakening. During their months on the desolate planet, whilst waiting for Mark to heal, Nolan is truly being a man of his words, and as we are then shown, months has passed, and that thankfully, they were both able to have all grievances set aside and genuinely have a father-son relationship. The most cathartic, emotionally depthful scene by far for what I and a lot of other people in the fandom believe is for one of the most goated characters in the show. Nolan's apology to Debbie is a perfect reflection for that sort of messiness that real life, from the bottom of the heart, apologies are like. You can see the regret, awkward pausing, eating up at him as he continues to speak his side of the story. But what makes it even better? Debbie does not take his bullshit. Yes, Nolan has defected from his kind. He has chosen to be better and even fight in a war that could end up in his death. But we need to understand that despite all of this, what does that all have to do with her, Debbie, in the context of how much she's been hurt by the betrayal of trust in this relationship of theirs? And another thing that I like is the fact that she starts off with the grievances and pain of others, and then only starts on her own pain. It's not only a great reflection of her great character, but also stands as yet another reminder to the viewers of the amount of chaos and destruction Nolan has caused. There are simply some things that cannot be fixed, words that cannot be taken back, and actions that can never be undone. I understand you're all wanting me to talk about Nolan and the path to redemption, and trust me, we will get there, but just give me a moment to touch on something that's been on my mind about not only the fandom, but just people in general. There's a very vocal portion of any community, fictional or otherwise, that simply rejects the idea of extending grace to someone trying to be better than who they used to be. I want to be very clear by stating that I understand why that reaction exists. A lot of people have been genuinely hurt, betrayed, abused, put through things that leave real lasting scars, things I wouldn't wish on anyone. So when they see someone who's done something terrible trying to change, the instinct is often to reject it outright. I get that more than you know. I've been in spaces like that before, and I've also been on both sides of it. And I understand why people reject the idea of Nolan's redemption because of that. But I do think there's a line where that mindset starts to become harmful in itself, because if we apply that same standard universally, where no one is ever allowed to grow beyond the worst thing they've done, then what we end up with isn't even accountability anymore. It's just permanent. A world where people are defined forever by their lowest point, with no room for growth, no room for repair, and no room for becoming better, even when they're genuinely trying. And I say this from personal experience. There were moments in my own life where I was the one who needed to change, where I needed to grow out of who I was at the time. And if I was never given the chance to do that, or the space, I would have been locked into that version of myself forever. And if that was the case, then I genuinely don't think I'd be who I am today. I wouldn't be someone trying to build himself up, or trying to help others, or trying to live by the idea of being better than I was yesterday. Not because I'm perfect now, far from it. I still make mistakes, I still have things to work on, but the difference is that I'm allowed to work on them. And I think that's the distinction that really matters, because there's a difference between saying what you did was wrong and saying you will always be nothing more than what you did. One allows accountability and growth to coexist, while the other just straight up removes the concept of growth entirely, and in many cases worsens everything for the redemptionee, because it could then eventuate in them falling even further than before due to said pushback, with things getting even worse than that. Despite what the internet is constantly trying to tell you, nuance matters, because a person who does something bad isn't necessarily a bad person forever, but if there's someone who refuses to ever understand the impacts of their actions, even after being notified of it, then alright, it's free game by that point. I mean, I'm just saying, like, you're justified to have your guard up when it comes to that, you know? Because I'm more than willing to bet my life most of, if not everyone, has been there at some point. In that place where you feel like you've messed up so badly that you can never be seen the same way again. That feeling of feeling irredeemable. That isn't how people work. You're not permanently your worst action. You are the direction you choose to move in after it. Life is all about making mistakes, and just sometimes things can get real messed up. Again, I understand why people reject that idea. If you've been hurt badly enough, it's easier to believe that people don't change at all, because believing they can means opening yourself up to being hurt again. But at the same time, I can't fully agree with that mindset either, because if all we ever do is just reduce people down to the worst thing they've ever done and get rid of that humanistic nuance whilst denying their possibility of growth entirely, then we're not just protecting ourselves, we're just closing the door on something that is fundamentally human. Change isn't black and white. It's messy, inconsistent, and sometimes it fails. But that doesn't make it any less real. And if we refuse to acknowledge that possibility, then we're not just denying others the chance to grow, we're denying it for ourselves as well. Choosing to ignore most of the most fundamental parts of being human, the capacity to be flawed, to reflect, and to change. And I'm not talking about performative change or empty words, alright? I mean people who are genuinely putting in the effort, who really understand the error in their ways and are trying to do better. If there's no room for even a little bit of compassion for that, then you're not part of the problem Nolan represents. You're just part of a different one entirely. I'm just saying. Speaking of Nolan, when talking about his arc, I think it begins with something brutally simple, yet incredibly difficult to actually do. A genuine realization that what you did was wrong. Not a justification, not a reframing, not an attempt to lessen the weight of it, but just the full, unfiltered acceptance of your actions and the consequences that came with them. Because, in my opinion, without that, nothing that follows can ever truly be called redemption. But even that isn't enough, because realization is passive and redemption is not. It's all about action. What defines it, at the very least, to me, is the decision to actively move against the person you once were. To not just acknowledge your past in full, unadulterated 100% view, but to stand in direct opposition to it for your actions. To not just say you've changed, but to prove it consistently over time, without any guarantee that it will fix anything that's already been broken. And more importantly, to keep doing it even when it doesn't benefit you. Because this is where I think a lot of people get it wrong. Redemption is not dependent on forgiveness. It is not validated by acceptance. It most certainly is not sustained by how others choose to perceive you. Real redemption is much quieter than that. And it's choosing to do what's right over and over again, even in that quietness. And I think that's why Nolan's arc works as well as it does, because the show never allows his redemption to exist in isolation. It constantly tests it, challenges it, and forces it into situations where words mean nothing and only actions remain. With Art, we see that acceptance does not equal forgiveness. With Cecil, we see that change does not erase consequence. With Oliver, we see that redemption does not rebuild what was never truly there. And with Debbie, we see that even with the most sincere apology, it does not undo the damage that's already been done. Each of these interactions strip away a different illusion surrounding redemption itself. The concept that it guarantees forgiveness, restores relationships, or make things right again. It doesn't. Redemption doesn't fix the past, and it doesn't even balance it out. All it does is define who you choose to be moving forward. And in Nolan's case, that choice is made again and again in the way he fights for Earth, even when he isn't trusted, in the way he shows up, even when he isn't wanted, and of course in the way he continues forward, fully aware that there may never be a moment where everything is resolved. But he does it anyway, and I think that's what redemption truly is. Just a choice that you continue to make every single day, knowing full well that it may never be enough, and yet choosing to do the right thing anyway.